Good morning and welcome to the ATSE Agricultural and Food Forum webinar on artificial meats and alternative proteins. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from the lands from which we meet today all over Australia. In my case, coming from Wurundjeri lands, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. In doing so, I pay my respects to the elders of the past, present and emerging elders of these custodians. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining this webinar today. Welcome. These webinars are run by the ATSE forum are generally titled this year, we're under Feeding a Carbon Neutral World, and this webinar falls into that very neatly. In sense, because that the demand for protein in the world continues to escalate as we have more people, but probably equally importantly, these people are wealthier and able to afford to eat animal protein. And today's webinar is what sort of proteins might be available in the future. Today, my colleague, John Dixon, who is the chair of the ATSE ACT division, is the co-moderator of this webinar, and that division is the co-sponsor of this webinar. I'd like to get underway now, actually, and firstly to introduce Michelle Colgrave. Professor Michelle Colgrave is the Chief Investigator of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Innovation in Peptide and Protein Science and leader of the CSIRO Future Protein Mission. Michelle was actually the recipient of an award sponsored by ATSE through the Ag and Food Forum, the ICM Young Leaders, Young Researcher Award 2 years ago. So we congratulate you, Michelle, and we welcome you. The second speaker today is Professor Paul Wood, AO. Paul has led R&D teams in CSIRO, CSL, Pfizer, Animal Health at that point, and brought many new products onto the market in his long and distinguished career. The housekeeping for today will be, I will firstly ask Michelle to speak, and Paul will speak directly after Michelle. And then we will go to questions, and I ask you all to ask your questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. That makes it most efficient, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. So it's my pleasure now to ask Michelle to begin her presentation.
So thanks to the Academy for the invitation to speak today. I'm speaking from Yagarabil country, which is home to the Turrbal people. And I acknowledge Aboriginal people as our oldest continuing culture, and I pay my respects to elders, acknowledging their generosity in sharing knowledge. Today we will share some views on how we as scientists can deliver sustainable proteins for our growing populations. So, as you've just heard, we face this grand challenge, and this challenge is immense. The global population is expected to grow to 9.7 billion by 2050, and protein is a building block of life. We need to produce more protein, more sustainably from more sources to feed the world. But we can't continue to increase our agricultural land use, yet we require around 70% more food than is currently produced. In fact, Asia will be home to more than half the world's population by 2030 and have an annual food spend of 8 trillion, yet only 1/4 of Asia's landmass is arable. So the challenge is, how do we meet this global food gap, but at the same time maintain our planet's health? We also have a changing world. The demand for protein, as you've heard, is being driven by this rising world population and an emerging middle class. The world's population is exiting poverty, and we've recently reached a tipping point where more than half of the population is now considered middle class or wealthier, with the majority of those people living in urban areas. So if you draw your attention to the graph, you can see some of these bubbles moving up. So we can see that as GDP increases, we can see that meat consumption increases. So we can see that people are moving towards these energy-dense diets that include more animal-derived protein products. But there's also a growing social conscience around planetary health. Globally, we rely on a relatively small range of food. This negatively impacts our health and also the health of the planet. 75% of the global food supply comes from only 12 plants and 5 animal species. And to this point, meat, aquaculture, eggs and dairy use the vast majority of the world's farmland, accounting for up to 83%, and that means that about 57% of all food-related emissions. Yet we're only producing around 37% of the world's protein and 18% of its calories through these sources. So alternative protein sources offer the potential to complement these traditional protein industries and to offer a reduced agricultural environmental footprint. So around the world, people are looking to alternative sources of nutrition. And at CSIRO, we've focused on protein as this necessary macronutrient. But there's a broad range of opportunities to explore. And this includes insects, algae, and even cultivated meats. And we've seen reports like the Eat Lancet report that have proposed the planetary health diet. And this is a means to address some of the impacts of the diets on the environment. And they've mapped these regional diets against this. And what you can see in this slide is that there's a real mismatch between the proposed diet and the current consumption patterns. And if we look to North America on the right-hand side, you can see that there's quite an imbalance in terms of the meat consumption as well as poultry and eggs. Whereas if we look towards sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that there's an unbalanced reliance on starchy vegetables. So we can see that the food systems aren't necessarily equitable in these current consumption patterns. Further, when we look at projecting the impact of humanity on the Earth, the reports have also reported several mitigation measures to reduce these impacts. And these are varied and across 5 different categories. But we can see that a dietary shift towards increased vegetable and legume consumption and incorporating a more diverse diet is one of those strategies. Another innovation is the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production systems. And one of the solutions that CSIRO has been working on is that of Future Feed. So this is a red seaweed-based feed supplement. And you can see that, well, with this red seaweed, as it's fed as a supplement to cattle, it actually massively reduces the methane production caused by enteric fermentation. So in the initial feedlot trials, the methane was reduced over 80% when they just added a very small amount to the feed. At the same time, the animals that were supplemented with this were also more productive in terms of both their average daily weight gain and their feed conversion efficiency. So there are already strategies in place to go towards maintaining our current livestock production systems, but in a more sustainable manner. But we're also seeing changing consumer preferences. So we're witnessing this shift towards reducitarian or flexitarian lifestyles. Now, this is where consumers still eat meat, but perhaps less. They aim to consume alternative products a few times per week. And these changing dietary patterns are due to concerns over the impact of the diets on the planet, but also concerns around animal welfare and personal health and nutrition. In Australia, around 10% of our population are either vegan or vegetarian, and that number's been steadily increasing since 2012. But up to 1/3 of Australians are actively reducing their meat consumption. And the future purchasers, the millennials, are the primary demographic adopting plant-based diets. But consistently, all generations are nominating health, the environment, and animal welfare as important reasons to reduce their meat consumption. On the graph on the right-hand side here, you can see that we've got about a 20% increase that you can see by the blue dashed line, and that's over the concern over the environmental impact. But that didn't necessarily immediately convert to an equivalent decrease in red meat consumption. We've now seen around a 10% decrease per capita over the past decade, but it's really only occurred over the last 5 years or so. So perhaps we're only just starting to see these thoughts converting into actions. But outside of traditional protein production, we're also exploring alternative protein sources. But I like to call them complementary protein sources, because what is alternative to us may not be to others. So they may be actually common to others, like insects, where 2 billion people around the world eat insects on a daily basis. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about alternative protein sources, including plant-based and insects, but also some of the cellular protein sources, and Paul will later cover off on cultivated meats. But in 2020, CSIRO's Futures team released a report that looked at and valued these agricultural and food opportunities. And they're able to show that by shifting towards their consumption and production of plant-based protein as an example, and alternative proteins, that we're able to achieve both economic growth opportunities in both domestic and export markets that would equate to jobs that would be created onshore. But additionally, we're also able to achieve around $2.3 billion in environmental savings. So while soy and wheat are the current main alternatives to meat and dairy, there's innovation that's on the way to integrate high protein pulses, such as lupins and chickpeas, as well as algal ingredients, including spirulina, and insects into packaged food and beverages. These plant sources offer compelling nutrients like fibre and omega fatty acids. They can tout lower calories and have a lower carbon footprint. And they're being promoted as natural, more sustainable alternatives, taking pressure off land and water. Now, recent reports such as the 50 Future Foods report have also identified several underutilised plant crops. So these include fava beans, the Bambara groundnut, and mung beans. And so as an example, Bambara groundnuts are the 3rd most important legume in Africa. They've gained interest amongst sustainable food experts because they are considered not only underutilised, but highly nutritious, and they can grow in challenging environments, even highly acidic soils. They boast an impressive nutrient profile, both from the perspective of the farmer and the consumer, and they're considered a complete food because of the balance of both macronutrients accompanied by their amino acid and fatty acid content. So as an example of CSIRO innovation, you can see that of V2 Food. It's an Australian producer of plant-based substitutes, and it's a joint venture between CSIRO and Competitive Foods Australia, backed by Main Sequence Ventures. And in a very short time, the team were able to produce a plant-based product that was able to mimic meat by layering on flavour and texture systems, combined with processing technology. So V2 Food was developed in response to this strong consumer demand for high-quality plant-based but convenient products. So the priorities include new high-protein crops. We need to have neutral flavour profiles that avoid things like the beanie flavour, and we're aiming for non-GM crops that can be sustainably grown in Australia. And the opportunity now exists to use locally grown plant protein sources in these food products, and that will bring benefits back to our growers. So soy has been used extensively and offers many benefits. It's a high protein source, and that it generally sits around 40% protein. So that translates to what you find in the soy meal itself, but then you can concentrate it further to get it up to 50 to 90%. It's also ideal as a food ingredient because it's got great functionality, solubility, taste, smell, or in fact, it's a lack of those taste and smell that you're after. And from a nutritional standpoint, it's quite close to our traditional protein sources like milk and dairy in terms of its amino acid profile and its digestibility. But there are also other options for our consumers, and these include things like delivering hybrid or blended products. And these can get the best of both worlds. So you can get the protein, the iron, the zinc, and the fatty acids from meat. And you can use them in combination with prebiotic or probiotic fibers from plants. So these types of products offer an alternative for those reducitarians or flexitarians who aren't quite ready to give up meat, but would like to reduce their meat consumption for the reasons I alluded to earlier. And as we think to the future, there's some great technology that's coming through that's really going to, I guess, identify what's coming next. And one of those technologies is that of artificial intelligence. And that's a technology with great potential to transform our food systems. So thinking about plant selection for food, before we had AI, as scientists, we had to follow a long series of steps. We had to first begin by searching the planet for edible plants, of which over 250,000 exist. And then we have to thoroughly analyze each candidate. We have to identify how those plants are made from the molecules and how each of those molecules and components work together. And these then are put into a database and containing millions of entries. So this analysis alone isn't enough. We then have to think about when we put these ingredients together, it can be difficult to predict how they'll react, sometimes causing unpleasant textures or flavors, and those results can be highly unforeseeable. But with AI, it's a whole new ball game. Instead of just manually tasting and expecting to hit a jackpot by sheer chance, AI uses a more logical approach. It does so through machine learning, which is a technique that basically allows a computer to learn how to solve a problem by trying and failing at it many times. So it may not get it right the first time, but it improves with every mistake, and it's helped by human feedback. And the results can be really quite surprising. So Just is a company that found that the isolated protein of the Indian legume, the mung bean, has very similar properties to scrambled eggs. And the Chilean-based company Notco used AI to design a plant-based mayonnaise that uses peas, basils, potatoes, and canola oil to achieve the same outcome, but minus the dairy. And I find that really interesting because I would never have put those together into a smoothie, for instance. But if we think about some of their more interesting formulations, they're now looking at a chocolate prototype that combines broccoli, goji berries, a champignon mushroom, and a nut. So these are really quite interesting combinations to deliver these unique flavors. So then moving beyond plants, we can think about insects, and they're highly efficient at food conversion. And in parallel, they can produce frass that can be used as a valuable fertilizer. And these insect production systems can be a considerable contributor to our circular economy. They also provide compelling nutrition. They have high quality protein and micronutrients such as iron. Now, crickets are now being farmed in small operations in Australia for delivery of new ingredients that can be used to fortify our foods. And we've seen approval of other insects such as the mealworm by the European Food Safety Authority. So these less common foods in Australia may soon be ready choices as snacks, ingredients, or even perhaps centre of plate options for those adventurous. Insects can deliver protein and do so with far less inputs, in particular less land and less water. So these are attractive as alternatives, and I think Paul will agree with me on this one. But the question is, are you ready to eat insects? So another technology that we're looking to deploy is to deliver protein via fermentation. Now, this is not fermentation in the traditional sense that we've used for thousands of years to make cheese, make yogurts, and even beer. We're actually exploring options like biomass fermentation, and that's used to generate mycoprotein based on the cultivation of fungal mycelia, so mushrooms of sorts, and that we generate this mycoprotein by fermentation as a biomass. And that's similar to the product you can see there, corn, which has been around for several decades now. But we're also exploring a technique called precision fermentation, and that involves engineering yeast or other microbes to deliver specific proteins. And here we're focusing on health and functionality as the key areas. So if we think about it and we think about disruption in agricultural systems, we can look back in history and we can see some really interesting, periods of time. So initially, around 10,000 years ago, we saw the first domestication of plants and animals, and it really marked a pivotal point in human history. We started breeding plants and animals and eating these and also using them in work. Then later, we started to begin manipulating microorganisms in a more direct way through experiments in fermentation like I just described. And that was to make staple foods like bread and cheese, and also for food safety, because this fermentation provided a way to preserve fruits and vegetables. So in a sense, humans were now able to control the production of food. But now we stand on the cusp of this next great revolution in food production. These new technologies allow us to manipulate microorganisms to a far greater degree, essentially allowing us to unplug microorganisms entirely from the macroorganisms and harness them directly as efficient units of nutrient production. So going back to the example of the cow, it's actually the microorganisms in the rumen that are responsible for breaking down the cellulose in grass and forage. And it enables the cow to access the nutrients in those cellulose-rich diets and provide the cow with a protein source. So in this way, we can imagine a time where we utilize these same bacteria, but rather cycling the nutrients via the animal, we can imagine cultivating these bacteria in closed-loop systems, where the necessary nutrients for bacterial protein production can come from crops or food waste. And we can use these food waste streams and we can even recover the waste from manufacturing to feed the yeast or microorganisms. So the current focus is on generating high-value ingredients, and these could be used as additives into other foods or to enhance the flavour, the mouthfeel, the functionality, and importantly, the nutrition. And so an example of that is that of Nourish Ingredients. It's a new company that are creating animal fats, but without the animal. They're creating non-animal derived fats and oils, but they can also produce protein and enzyme ingredients in these closed loop circular systems, as I mentioned, using waste or side stream as inputs. And these highly valued ingredients can deliver the taste, the mouthfeel, or the nutrition to serve to replace the long list of ingredients that we sometimes find on some of our current plant-based products. And a second example is that of alternative dairy, in this case, precision fermentation derived dairy. So there's examples like Perfect Day in the US, and then there's companies like Brew here in Australia. And they're using the power of yeast and synthetic biology to deliver milk proteins like casein within bioreactors or breweries instead of in udders. So these proteins like casein are responsible for that creamy mouthfeel of milk and the stretchy nature of cheese. And they form these three-dimensional structures known as micelles. So Brew is the latest CSIRO-backed company to launch in this protein space, and their first products will be nature equivalent, delivering the exact same proteins as you would find in milk. But we can imagine a new version where all the proteins that are known to trigger food allergy have actually been eliminated to provide a safe and nutritious product that would be safe for all those who suffer from food-related anaphylaxis. And these food production systems are really interesting because they're not as affected by climate change or the impacts on traditional agricultural practices like increasing temperature, salinity, or pest stresses, but they do require access to water and can have high energy requirements. So their sustainability will depend on the implementation of renewable energy technologies. So with a changing climate, with changing population in terms of both growth and dynamics, and changing consumer preferences, what we're doing is we're using innovation across all protein sectors to create choice for consumers and to deliver optimized nutrition. In doing so, we're aiming to fully utilize our constrained resources and improve the productivity of our protein production systems and create value for all value chain participants, expanding on current and developing new Australian industries along the way. So at CSIRO, we launched a future protein mission, which aims to grow Australia's protein industries by addressing these growing opportunities because of the demand for protein. And just yesterday, we launched a protein roadmap that explores the opportunities at Australia's fingertips and estimates the value that can be created by these technology-led changes in our agri-food systems. And with that, I'll conclude by saying thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions after you've heard from Paul.
And thanks, Michelle and Snow. Okay, so what I'm going to deal with today, so Michelle's giving you a really nice overview of all the potential. I'm just going to look at one of these technologies, and I'm going to answer the question I've got up on the screen there today. So can cell-based meats, will it disrupt traditional meat production? Because this is a key issue about that some groups are actually claiming that we're going to see the collapse of the red meat industry based on this. So that's the issue. It's not whether the technology works, because let's make this statement up front. We've been culturing cells for a long time. I did that as a young PhD student. So we can do that, and more recently we've been doing it at quite reasonable scale. Monoclonal antibodies, sort of most of the big drugs that you use today are produced through cell culture, as well as some of the recent COVID vaccines. The adeno-vectored vaccine from AstraZeneca is produced in cell culture. So we can do that. That's not the question. So the question I'm going to address today is, can it be done at a scale and a cost that it really will disrupt red meat production? Because that's the issue. So this is a report that came out in 2019, I think, Rethink X, and this is probably what got me started on a sort of a journey of looking at this technology very closely. So Rethink X put out this report, and you can see, I won't read through all of it, but essentially it predicts the collapse of the red meat industry because of what they're calling precision fermentation. When I was a student, we called it recombinant protein production, but it now has this nice term, precision fermentation. And you can see the figures there. So basically, they're going to say, by using these technologies, the cost of proteins are going to be five times cheaper by 2030 and 10 times cheaper by 2035. And hence, this is really what we're going to see, the collapse. And these are I've just quoted their words. We're going to see the collapse of the meat and milk industry because of these technologies. Now, obviously, if you're a red meat farmer or a dairy farmer, this might actually terrorize you, but let me just go through. As I said, this is just going to be focused on the cell-based meat. And let's have a look at what the challenges are that faces this technology. So firstly, just to describe some of the key players. There's a couple of groups very strongly promoting this technology. The Good Food Institute out of the US, Cellular Ag in Australia, Bianca Lee set that up a couple of years ago. You see a couple of companies there. There's something like 80 companies in the field now. But you can see some of the capital raise. So Future Meat Technologies, their more recent raise, $347 million. Most of the meats, 160 million. And this was founded by Professor Post, who was the first one to actually produce a cell-based burger. We've now seen the first commercial product hit the market in Singapore from Just Eats. But I might add that that's a product that's sold in a single restaurant. So I wouldn't really call it a commercial success. It is a licensed product, but it's very limited in its availability. We've got groups that are planning to do 3D steak. Because remember, this technology is actually about producing a burger. Burgers are pretty big in the US market. They're less so in many other markets. As Michelle said, we've also got groups looking at cultivated fats. So Nourish in Canberra, Mission Barn in the US, the two companies are looking at producing animal fats. We also have a cell-based meat company in Sydney, Val, but they're actually looking at exotic meat. So their sort of market opportunity is very different than looking at basically a commodity meat product. Let's just remind us also, what's the value of the global meat market? And here's some figures here, 2,308 billion in value and 340 million tons. So that's the industry as it exists today that cell-based meat is seeking to replace. So here's the basics of the technology. It's pretty straightforward. In this case, we take cells from an animal, in this case, a cow. They can be embryonic stem cells or they can be muscle cells. We have to, the key issue there, we have to have a fermenter. It can vary, a lot of the work at the moment is fairly low scale, 100 litres or so, but people are talking about doing 10,000 litre fermentations, even larger. There's talk about building a 300,000 litre fermenter in the UAE. So that cell culture, they need nutrients, growth factors, proteins, fatty acids. We generally use serum, bovine serum, but obviously a lot of this technology is trying to appeal to that vegan market. So they're going to replace that bovine serum. And then we cultivate the cells And the final step is a differentiation to muscle fibers, and then it's harvested, and you can produce burgers, but you can also produce sausages, meatballs, etc. Overall, in scaling this is probably about a 60-day process from start to finish if you're going to aim at that 10,000 litre. So it's quite a long culture period. So here's some of the challenges, and I'll go through these each one at a time. So the biology of mammalian cells, very different from growing bacterial cells, yeast cells, etc. The sort of culture media you need, the capital cost of facility, a major issue. Can you maintain a sterile environment? Remember, they're not going to be allowed to use antibiotics in the media, which is standardly what we use when we're in the lab. We put a bit of antibiotics in there to make sure our cultures don't get contaminated. We also got to deal with consumer. The consumer in the end, as I think Michelle's talked about, the consumer decides in the end the acceptability of any food product. The regulatory environment and also environment impact. Again, the mantra of everyone in food production today is how do you make your products more sustainable? So let's look at each of these challenges. So the first one, the biology of the mammalian cell. So the first thing is that primary cells actually are quite difficult to grow, and to grow in continuous culture, and to maintain their phenotype. They also have limits about how they like to grow, their density. So some people are saying, oh, we'll just increase the density threefold. Now, I can tell you cells don't like that. So that's, you can say that we want to do that, but mammalian cells have a mind of their own, and they don't like actually growing above certain densities. Extraneous agents. Anyone who's done cell culture knows that keeping things out of your cell culture is one of the major problems. This is not only things that may come in, but remember, when you take those cells, you've also got to demonstrate to the regulatory authorities that there are no nasty viruses in those cells, etc. They need special proteins, albumin, insulin, transferrin, a couple of growth factors, and buffers pH. So this is a complex media that we're talking about. Scaling, as I said, because you generally scale up, the general rules is you scale up sort of 10-fold. You can't just take 10 mils and put it in a 10,000 litre fermenter. You've got to scale it up. And that's why this chain, generally our calculations, it'd be about the 60-day process to finally produce your product if you're going to that 10,000 litre scale. People point to the fact that there's, the pharmaceutical industry has been doing this for a while, and that's the industry I came out of. But most of our gains, which is about 10-fold, has been by genetically modifying the cells, transforming the cells. Now, I think that's going to be a difficulty in the end, because the nature of a transformed cell is we make it a tumor-based cell, and that's probably not going to work for a food-based product. So some of the technologies that we've used in the pharmaceutical industry are not going to be acceptable for a food-grade product. Mammalian cells grow more slowly. That's a fundamental. That's why it's that 60-day culture. And finally, because this is the one that gets quoted to me all the time, people quote Moore's law about technology improvements. Well, Moore's law has never been used for a biological system. So we've got to be a bit careful about throwing it around and saying, just like semiconductor chips, the cost will come down. The cost will come down, but whether they can come down the way computer chips is a question I would ask. So let's look at the media. So there was a report put out by CE Delft, and they looked at the cost of media, and this is their report. They said that the media cost would need to be decreased by 100 to 10,000-fold. So not a trivial amount. And this was based on the data from the existing cultivated meat companies. Stem cells also even more fastidious to grow. So there's scenarios. They ran a whole lot of scenarios, decreasing the costs, growing the cells at higher density. I mentioned that. Cheaper sources of amino acids, dramatically reducing the cost of the protein. So make these proteins through recombinant protein production. And if you look at that, recombinant proteins at the moment, they can be as cheap as $40 a gram, but they can be up to $1 million a gram. And that's some of these growth factors that are included. are some of the ones that cost a lot to do. So yes, can you bring down the cost? Yes, you can. But can you bring it down 10,000-fold? I think that's going to be more difficult. The volumes of media required are going to be higher than the estimates, because what they haven't really factored in is in the terminal stages, you're going to actually have to wash the cells. So you're going to actually have a couple of flushes of media just to get out a lot of the components that are in the media that you can't actually have in the final product. So the volumes of media. The other thing that's really fundamentally, and probably which hits me from the start, they've made an assumption that media cost is 80% of the cost of cells. Now, I'm going to guess that they've never talked to anyone who's actually run a facility, a GMP-based facility, because the costs are about 20%, capital costs, labor costs, etc. So that's a fundamental problem with the calculations, that they're not, media isn't 80%. We estimate it's probably closer to 20%. So let's have a look at the cost of the facility. So the Delft report itself said a facility to produce 10 kilotons of cell-based meat is $450 million US. Now, they left a few components out. They didn't actually have QC in there, didn't have formulation, packaging. So our calculation on this facility would be closer to 600 million US. What they do not factor into the cost is the depreciation of that capital. And you must do that. That's a fundamental of manufacturing. So the standards of manufacture assumed, they assume they can actually use food grade manufacturing. Now, even if the regulatory authorities agree to this, I don't believe that's possible, because the risk of contamination is so great. The energy costs of these facilities, and again, there are independent reports on this, that if you don't use renewable energy, you're probably not going to be any more energy efficient than conventional meat production. You're going to have to filter all the air coming into this facility, all the water coming in. The incubators run at 38 degrees Celsius. So this is a high energy. So you have to actually have completely renewable energy sources if you're going to have a climate acceptable production system. So this is a meat facility, and this is probably why I look at it and go, could I use a facility like that to do cell culture? This is the facility that I'm used to. This is a GMP facility. You can see in there all the surfaces are clean. You can see the PPE that people are wearing. This is the sort of facility that I believe will have to be used. Now, the interesting thing is that we're actually seeing the first of the scaled up facilities now. And Upside in the States has created a facility. And I might add, it looks a lot like this. People are wearing full PPE, it's stainless steel fermenters. And remember, we're just seeing the top floor. This facility would actually probably be 3 stories high. The bulk of the fermenter is below this particular floor. So a fundamental issue where I disagree is the fact that I do not believe a standard food grade facility is going to be possible. And these are some of the things. So the acceptable quality standard for cell-based fermenters is going to be required. You need positive pressure. Every time you open a door, air rushes in, and that air contains a lot of spores. Fungi love this media. This is an absolute delight for fungi. All the water, culture media, will need to be distilled, sterilized. All incoming goods will need to be QC'd, sterilized before entering a clean room. Staff will have to wear full PPE and are highly trained. So again, if we look at the labor rates that they quoted, we don't think they're reasonable. These are highly skilled people who work in these type of facilities. There's going to be some form of terminal sterilization at the end to be stored, or you're going to have to ship frozen. So again, you probably get away. You can probably have, it won't be a sterile product at the end, but you've still got a shelf life on that product. And, a thing I learned in microbiology, you can't be a little bit sterile, just like you can't be a little bit pregnant. So the nature of consumer products. Okay, so things like insulin, these are pharmacologically active ingredients, and you're going to have to get them out of the slurry. So again, that's what, at the end of the process, you're going to have a couple of washes. And when you talk about washes, we're talking about 10,000 litres. And it's going to have to be relatively gentle. Cells, are quite fragile. And once they rupture and release their DNA, the whole thing just turns into a slurry. It's a bit like Play-Doh, that you give the kids, you can't actually work with it once you get that DNA released in any significant amount. So this is an extensive process. The downstream processing is expensive, and it can often be a rate limiting step. As I said, it's going to be a cell slurry is the final product, and even just freezing that material, you actually have to process it. Otherwise, you can't freeze it. The cells will just pop. You're going to actually then have to add things back. So you're going to have to add fats for taste and texture. So I think things like what Nourish is doing are going to be quite handy, because you're going to have to add those things back. You're going to have to add back minerals and vitamins, calcium, iron, B12, because they're not going to be in the cells that you culture. So the cells are just going to be one component of your final product. Shelf life, no preservatives we expect in this. Is it going to be stored, shipped frozen? And finally, it's not a prime steak. So if I go to the markets at the moment, I can buy a nice piece of meat, probably going to cost me 40 to 50 kilograms. But that's a prime steak or a nice piece of lean lamb. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about sausages, meatballs, hamburgers. So consumers or the regulatory in the US, it's the FDA, the USDA. In Europe, there's going to be questions about recombinant proteins. The Impossible Burger, which is a plant-based burger, has recombinant heme in it, and that product can't be sold in Europe because of the recombinant heme. There's questions on labels. We just had a Senate inquiry. So there's questions about what you can label. The taste of the products. I don't know what, cells don't really taste like anything. So you're going to have to add taste back into the product, probably from the fats. Nutritional value, I think Michelle's raised it. We've got to make sure any food is more nutritious than what we're often feeding today. So that nutrition's got to be at the top. Competition. So the competition is actually going to be plant-based for these products. That's the real competition. It's going to be plant-based rather than conventional meat. Cost, I don't believe there's any scientific evidence that you can decrease the costs 1,000-fold. Yes, you can run a whole lot of scenarios, but there's little data at this stage that you can actually get these costs. And I finished with this, one of my favorite pieces of street art here in Fitzroy. This is Rhone. Never say never. So, I don't say the technology can't work. What I believe is the technology will produce a high-cost product for a niche market. It will not disrupt the red meat market. And thank you. I'll leave it there and look forward to some questions.
Those were two very stimulating presentations indeed. In very different tones in a way. They're complementary presentations with contrasting messages for us. From Michelle, a very rosy, bright future for alternative proteins. And from Paul, some rather pragmatic cautionary notes about the potential of cell-based meats to disrupt our red meat industries. So we have a couple of questions in our Q&A, but I'd like first to put a question to Michelle. Is it the case that animal and fish feeds is a first step forward in terms of commercialization of alternative proteins for the food industry? So that's the contrast between food and feed and the different regulatory requirements. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you, John. And it's already the case, right? What we do right now with animal feed is we're incorporating plant-based protein, if you call that alternative. I don't necessarily put it in the alternative category, but we are incorporating those into the aquaculture feed as an ingredient to replace fish meal. We're also looking at how things like insects can be utilised, and that it'll have a lower regulatory burden than it would if it's going into human food. There's slightly different pathways that they'll follow. And we're also seeing, and Paul can attest to this, insect protein being used in things like pet food. So really great examples, because I don't know about you, but I've got a cat and my cat loves to chase insects and eat them just as part of its natural diet. So yeah, I think it's definitely the case.
Yeah, look, I can comment on that. As Michelle said, I'll declare I'm the chair of a board of a company that's in insect proteins, soldier flies. We produce dog treats as our first product, and obviously in the long run, and we actually chickens. People like to feed their chickens whole insects, so you can give them the whole grubs, etc. So at scale, yes, you can get down to the cost to match the current cost for fish meal and for chicken, feeds, etc. And it's going to be important because just came out of Africa, the feed cost going up is, feed costs for chicken in Africa is about 60% of the cost, and those costs are going up. So there's a lot of people who find that it's not profitable. So we do need alternatives for feeding animals as well.
Thank you, Paul. A question from Bill Herditch for you, and his question is: given that the grassland ruminant livestock play a key ecological role of processing and converting carbohydrate grass into a that is nutritionally inaccessible to humans, as we know, into high quality protein for human consumption, what is the scope for further increasing the efficiency of this traditional system? First to you, Paul, and perhaps Michelle, you have some comments as well.
Yeah, look, Meat Livestock Australia has an aim of being carbon neutral by 2030, and there's a lot of technologies. Michelle's mentioned some, so the rumen modifiers, red seaweed, also 3-knot, which is a product from DSM. So there's a number of rumen modifiers. Genetics is the other area. We know that there are various animals that have a lower emission rate. We know that grass-fed, cattle, essentially people are already producing carbon neutral products. So by putting more carbon into soils, etc. So there's a lot of potential, hence why that target. The dairy industry, we've got a target of 30% reduction. I think anyone who's actually in the sort of the ruminant area have got pretty aggressive targets for reducing our environmental footprint. And it's not just carbon, it's also about biodiversity as well is a key issue, runoffs into water. So there's a range of things that people are doing to ensure that the products of the future will be more sustainable.
I might just add to that point, there's a big difference in Australian production systems versus some in other jurisdictions, and that comes down to the way that we farm and produce. And so, we published a paper at CSIRO not long ago that looked at the net protein contribution, and that actually looks at how much human edible protein the cattle were actually intaking compared to what they produced. And the numbers were actually staggering. When you look at Northern Australia, it was something like 1,597 times the amount of edible protein that they were consuming as to what they were producing. And that's because we don't have those mega feedlots and that are using things like corn and soy that we would otherwise be able to eat. They're often just being fed with, maybe it's spent grain from brewing, maybe it's grain that's been downgraded because it's got some issues. So they're really not consuming that human edible protein, and so therefore they really are quite efficient. And then you add to that the supplements and the other ingredients to help improve efficiency, and we really sit pretty well compared to some regions.
Can I ask a supplementary question, which is occurring both for you, Paul, but also for Michelle, perhaps more for Michelle? If you do this all through precision fermentation, what's your carbon source? Do you have to go to a refined carbon source such as wheat, or just a cereal grain, or can you use a cellulosic source such as dried grass?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's research to be done to fully understand this, because every organism is different and every organism produces different enzymes that allows it to break down different materials. So some fermentation is based on corn fructose at the moment, but what we want to do is we want to actually utilize cellulosic materials. So we want to be able to utilize things that wouldn't otherwise ever enter the food system. And so you're getting sort of that biocircular economy. You're able to take those co-product streams from agriculture and utilize them as that carbon source, but equally looking at the nitrogen source and seeing how we can utilize that. So not going to refined products. And there's opportunities in Queensland around sugarcane and diversification of that industry. Sugar is not exactly in favour at the moment. So anything we can do there is going to be useful. And there's also other crops, things like grapes that otherwise are going to waste. And I think there's lots of opportunities to explore, but we need to match that input to the organism that we're going to be cultivating.
John, over to you.
So maybe, John, I could just to add to Michelle's comment. So one of the things you have to look at when you're looking at the input sources is the variability of those input sources. So, when I was at CSL, even for our bacterial systems, we actually pre-tested all of the source material, because we found that even the same produced product didn't actually grow our cells very well. So consistency will be an issue. So if you look at other sources, you just got to make sure it still works for your cells.
Thanks, Paul and Michelle. We have a question from Robin Warner in relation to the levels of cultivated meat in current products. She understands that current production often has only about 10 to 20% of cultivated meat. Would you like to comment first, Paul, on that? And then perhaps over to Michelle.
It's there's only one product on the market, so which is Just, and I understand that's 70% cells and 30% probably plant-based material, and you can't get that off their website. I think I've seen that in a couple of articles. I think more people are talking about blended products basically because the cost of the cells is going to be so high. There are companies like Nourish and Mission Barn that are saying, hey, look, you don't actually need the muscle cells. We'll just take fats. That's where the flavor is. So we could possibly get away with maybe 5% of the fat to give the flavor and mix in other things. So I think blended products will be the major outcome, and that's cost is going to drive that.
Perhaps another question to you, Paul, from Ronald Yu, is do you think that by modifying the scaffold, excuse me, the scaffold for muscle fibre to attach to, we can improve the quality of the cultured meat?
Look, yeah, people are looking at scaffolds at the moment. I think it's probably more in the, I think some salmon. I've seen some really interesting pictures of salmon where they used a scaffold. To be honest, it just adds to the cost because you have to actually have the cost of the scaffold as well. So I'm not sure. You probably get out and produce a better looking product. You look at some of those pictures of salmon, I'm sure Michelle's seen them as well. They look very much like the piece of salmon I buy in the markets at the moment, and that's by using scaffolds. But in general, it's another cost.
Michelle, there's a question from Dean Powell as to whether there's any plans for CSIRO to engage in R&D on cultivated meats.
Look, we're always looking at the emerging areas of protein production, and so we're exploring where there's opportunities. In terms of the mission, we've got a really ambitious target of creating $10 billion of value by 2030, and with that, we've got about a 5-year R&D horizon. So cultivated meat for us doesn't quite sit within that window because we know that it's a longer horizon in terms of delivery. But that's not to say that we won't be doing work in the space, or that we can't contribute to research programs that are coming up through the university sector to address this. But it's the horizon doesn't quite match what the mission's trying to achieve.
Thank you. A question to you, Paul, from Brodie Pierce. It really is you're focused on how cultivated meat probably won't disrupt the red meat industry. But how about precision fermentation and the dairy industry? Is that going to be an easier and perhaps a more convenient way to bring on alternative proteins under the guise of a dairy product onto the market?
Yeah, well, Michelle mentioned Eden Brew, and I think she can comment on that. So we're actually seeing there's a couple of companies in this area. I've done some calculations and published that yes, you could do that. There are 6 key proteins in milk, so you need to produce all 6 if you want to claim your equivalent. So if you do some calculations, and then you've got to add back, obviously, you've got to add back fat and minerals, etc. I work out that even with a fairly, significant R&D, you're probably about 3-fold the cost. So milk at the moment in Australia, we produce it around about 50 cents a litre. New Zealand's actually even lower, around 45 cents. It depends a bit on the regions you are in Australia. It's a bit more expensive up in Queensland. So that's the sort of product that you're going up against, a 50 cent a litre cost. Again, I can share that. It was just the back of the envelope. I think I worked out, I gave the cost of the proteins at about $100 a kilogram. So I think cost is going to be the issue. You obviously can get a lot closer because, it's not a 10,000-fold margin you've got to get across. But in the end, you also got to produce a product that has the same mouthfeel, the same nutrition, etc. So I think it's more probable. But remember, there's no alternative. There's no shortage of alternative milks. If I go into my supermarket, there's a whole shelf of alternative milks. They're taking about 11% of the market at the moment, but they're not growing. They're actually, the more that they're coming on the market, they're actually competing against each other. So they're not growing their share. And our surveys say that about 95% of households in Australia have a dairy product in the fridge.
I just want to add, and I want to address one word in that question, and that was disrupt, because I think the key point here is that we need more. And so you don't necessarily need to disrupt at all. What we're doing is we're filling a gap. So traditional proteins, dairy products will continue to provide that product that we're used to. But as we think about how do we produce more and how do we address that growing demand, that's where these products will complement and maybe there'll be a transition over time. Maybe they'll capture a bit of that market share, but I don't think we're talking about disruption here. We're actually just talking about how do we address this growing demand.
Thank you, Michelle. That was a very positive note to land on, I think, for many of our listeners. I would like to thank very much Paul and Michelle for very stimulating, well-prepared and absolutely timely presentations on critical topics for us, both in the bush and in the centre of our cities. So thank you very much for that. Thanks also to all of those who have put forward very stimulating questions in the Q&A. And sorry that we didn't get to every one of them, but no doubt this topic will remain live and in the public media for months and years to come. Without further ado, allow me to pass now to Snow Barlow to announce the next webinar.
Firstly, my thanks to Michelle and Paul for a very stimulating webinar. The next in the ATSE Ag and Food webinar series will be part of ATSE's Innovation Nation series, and which will feature 4 current and recent agricultural innovations. We can only fit 4, and that format is we will ask 4 terrific innovators in agriculture to describe their current innovation and how it is being brought to market in agriculture. So I look forward to seeing you all at that time, and I thank you all very much for your participation. But again, my deep thanks to the speakers. Cheerio, and have a lovely day.